infamous video games, not to be confused with the infamous video game series by Sucker Punch, but these are games that are constantly blasted. You'll constantly be reminded that they are some of the worst things to ever come out, whether it be for a series or in general for all like gaming, and they're stuff that people constantly bring as being the worst, but at the same time, people also refuse to forget them for better and for worse. Something I'm obligated to mention is always going to be E.T. Terrestrial's video game adaptation for the Atari 2600, mainly designed by one individual, Howard Scott Warshaw, being, hey, the logic being, E.T.'s a big movie, let's make a video game adaptation and everything. And while people constantly refer to as the game that nearly killed video games, it didn't really, or it caused the game market to crash. Yes, but only in North America, and only for consoles. PC gaming was still doing fine, and console people for other countries were still doing fine. It was, people really overhyped the video game market crash, but just the fact that it still caused one in a territory is still a big deal. But at the same time, people refuse to forget this game as well, partially because of the rumor of them burying the copies of the game, which then turned out to actually be a real thing that happened, but people tend to just want to bring it up and talk about this game because even if it's in infamy, it's still a legendary status because of it. Even when also in reality, it's not nearly as awful people make it out to be, it's just not exactly good either. Sonic the Hedgehog or Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 is what I want to mention here, specifically for the game itself, because yes, poor quality, level design wasn't there, very buggy, etc. But it's the fact that this is a game where it's a case that people just refuse to let it go that it ever happened. Like, it's always the benchmark of being one of the worst games ever made and will be brought up as if being forced to play it is a sign of torturing them. There's also a case where even nowadays, Sonic Team can't make a goddamn game without someone fearing it'll turn into another Sonic 06. I remember seeing interviews for Sonic XIII Generations, we're just talking about the new content, Sonic Generations, and they were afraid to get excited for the game because, be careful, they made 06 one time. It's like, damn.
But yeah, I got a little bit of hands-on time with Shadow. It is, honestly, there have been so many bad 3D Sonics. I played through the entirety of 06 on GiantBomb.com, and it was one of the worst times of my life. This is like, I feel like this game feels like kind of what they were going for if they had made that game successfully. It is 3D, it's a lot of, rail grinding, it's a lot of loops, there's a lot of times where you feel like you can kind of set the controller down.
And just watch Sonic just run.
Yeah, but that's kind of like, that's what Sonic is. I mean, that's what Sonic always was on Genesis, and like, that's how it would feel in a 3D space.
Y'all are obsessed with that game more than actual Sonic fans are. It's insane how there are games that can be so far removed from when they came out, and yet people will still have the fear of, what if this happens again? As we've seen no signs of it happening ever again. And that's just for one game for a Sonic series. This kind of thing that happens for other franchises where the developers can make one really bad game and people will dangle it over their heads for the rest of time. Which is then funny when Sonic 06 content was then also put more Shadow Generations, specifically a boss fight against Mephiles the Dark, and people enjoyed the boss fight Generations and the brief bit it did for Mephiles' character this many years after the fact, to the point where some now want more of Mephiles with their Sonic games, which, damn, more people who think, what if Infinite, another character from a divisive Sonic game, Sonic Forces, could also get a moment like that where people are like, damn, this is a cool use of this character. Who knows? But either way, people will dangle it over the company's head many years after the fact that you guys made this one really bad game one time, so therefore I must assume everything you make from this onward will be just as horrendous. Hell, Legend of Zelda CDI games are also just as infamous, but people don't hold out over Nintendo's heads. But Nintendo didn't make that game. I don't give two f***s. They freaking allowed it to happen. They freaking allowed them to have the rights to Zelda to make those games. They freaking still allowed it to release. I don't give two f***s if they didn't make it. they still said yes. Another case is Bubsy 3D, developed by Eidetic Studios. Another infamous case of this 3D platformer that came on the PS1 and essentially came out, I believe, slightly before the likes of R64 and all that, but this was a case of a game that was heavily panned and still brought up as one of the worst 3D platformers, but Eidetic Studio, people don't bring up, but also over the years, also developed stuff such as Siphon Filter, or also Days Gone, like stuff later down the road that they would make, which were stuff that, okay, Days Gone is more divisive, but people do constantly bring up and love Siphon Filter, but they won't bring up, Siphon Filter, wasn't that made by the Bubsy 3D people? Like, they'll just go, yo, Siphon Filter is freaking cool, and some people still hope for a Days Gone 2 to be made someday. I remember a very small amount of people who, when the Crash Insane trilogy was announced, were actually hesitant on the idea because the developer Vicarious Visions, with people typically citing that Watch Dogs Legacy Vicarious Vision, when a lot of the games on their repertoire tend to be licensed games, where stuff like the Power Rangers, SpongeBob, Barbie, Rescue Heroes, Disney cartoon shows, films like Shark Tale, Shrek, Over the Hedge, etc. Like, people are like, why should I get excited for this when this developer made all these? And then they got proven wrong when its same trilogy ended up being a beloved title, and it proves those small amount of naysayers. The highlight was a lot of people that I saw who were naysaying, but a small amount of them were naysaying because of the history of the developer. And now Vicarious Visions is now Blizzard Albany, and is just now in the Activision Blizzard cycle. Such is the fate of a developer who dares to do anything good with Activision gets absorbed to Call of Duty or Blizzard. But it shows how people were wary of Vicarious Visions, even if most people were just excited at the idea of, hey, they're redoing these Crash Bandicoot titles. When people post how they like DLC Devil May Cry, or wish that it got a follow-up, there will always be at least 1 or 10 people who will bring up questioning why would someone want a follow-up to DLC Devil May Cry, under the idea that the game was low quality, which it wasn't, and the idea of why someone want a sequel to a game that's low quality, to which the irony they're not facing is the fact that we're talking about the Devil May Cry franchise, where Devil May Cry 2 is often cited as one of the worst action games, and it is often put as the worst Devil May Cry game, period. And yet, that game got a sequel, in this case a prequel, which was Devil May Cry 3, Dante's Awakening, which ended up becoming a benchmark for 3D action games to this day. So it's one of those cases where just because one game's either people don't like it or is actually just really bad, doesn't mean a game that can come after it will suffer the same fate. Which again depends on the franchise that people has opinion, where people feel like, oh, Devil May Cry 3 worked out great, but they feel like it wouldn't happen again if DLC Devil May Cry would get a sequel, something like that. Or even the Resident Evil franchise, where there are many spin-offs that people don't talk about or don't enjoy, but people won't go, let's just end the Resident Evil franchise here. Like, people didn't want Resident Evil to end with 6, people didn't want to end with Resistance, people didn't want to end with Umbrella Corp or anything like that. They just wanted and hoped the next game will do better instead. In the video I brought up Sonic 06, which is an infamous game, but was also a commercial success because it sold so many copies. 2 other cases I'll bring up is Final Fantasy 13 and Final Fantasy 15. I often cited as people say that some of the worst RPGs ever made, to which I go, okay, look at me, look at me. Do you actually believe that Final Fantasy 13 and 15 are quote-unquote some of the worst RPGs ever made? Let's get real here, enough with the hyperbole. But many people have their issues with them, even though Final Fantasy 13 still affects the franchise to this day, thanks to mechanics such as Stagger, which so many games afterwards are really stealing from it in order to use it in their own way that ends up generally not be as good as the way 13 did it. Or, in the case of Final Fantasy 15, it's more so people never letting go the what-if scenario if it actually came out as Versus 13. So many people dedicate years to research everything, try to pick up every single piece of the puzzle of what Versus 13 could have been, even though we don't actually know a whole lot about Versus 13, but people are so obsessed with the what-if scenario, believing that if it came out Versus 13, it would have been a higher quality game. Just except for the fact that it was still being made on an unfinished engine. But it's one of those things where people are still to this day obsessed with what Versus 13 could have been, which is why some end up liking 15 because of the potential they felt it could have had, even if what they're wishing is nothing more than a dream, and someday dreams fade. But if you want an actual Turbo Final Fantasy game that people nowadays have forgotten, and for good reason, which also means forgotten that it was truly that bad, who remembers Final Fantasy All the Bravest? A mobile title that originally had to pay for, on top of having a gacha mechanic in order to earn new characters. What'd you do for the gameplay? You just kind of swiped on the screen and that's it. There was not much thought or anything. And this was during the time in which gacha games, at least in the West, weren't liked, so the idea of having to pay extra money to get a random character was something that actually pissed people off back then. An interesting dynamic compared to nowadays where people actually like gacha games. So once again, All the Bravest is the actual Turbo Final Fantasy game that I believe nowadays the base game is free, but you have to pay for the expansions. But it's still just a case of like, that's an actual Turbo Final Fantasy game, and it was legitimately so bad. Who's gonna bring up All the Bravest in conversation? Which is another aspect when it comes to deciding the worst kind of games. Like, do we focus on the ones that are still well known, possibly were commercial success, everything just because word of mouth reminds us that they weren't good? Or do we focus on the ones that were so bad that people don't even remember they even existed, even within their own franchise? Makes this one entire topic a bit confusing in that regard, especially since some people can label something the worst thing ever, even if it isn't actually that bad, or they just go based off its reception / half-fist of the franchise. Like, I would not say Metal Gear Survive is one of the worst games ever be made, but people will put it on a list as the worst thing ever made because it doesn't fit what a Metal Gear title should be, even if Metal Gear Survive does have its own fan base, and it's like below average at best, really. However, people complain about the oversaturation of the new Super Mario Bros. Line of games, where it's like the first one's like, oh, return to form, and they made another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, to the point where people were disliking the game just for being too samey, and not for anything the game actually did wrong whatsoever. It was quite a thing where people then appreciated, oh, New Super Mario 3D World way more, just because it wasn't another New Super Mario Bros. Game, which they also got on the Wii U as a launch title, New Super Mario Bros. U. One of those things where, do we count that as infamously bad game just because people were sick of it at the time? Even though nowadays, when we're to play New Super Mario Bros. U's freaking port on Switch, people will enjoy it. People despise Mega Man X7, and one of the reasons was because of how often the game loads and the long load times, especially during the boss rush. We were to play the X Legacy Collection, and the load times were basically trimmed down greatly to the point where they're a non-issue. Does that mean people will still despise X7 the same way they do? Surprisingly, I've seen some come to enjoy X7, but the crazy part is where people start saying X7 is what Mega Man Legends is supposed to be, and that's where I'm like, okay, you're taking it too far. Another thing, people despise X7, and you'll find people who still hate X7's existence. Just like how many popular games with legacies, everything in a video on, just like how many of those games can be repeated on someone's list or multiple lists because of the most well-known games, same thing happens with infamous games or heavily despised ones, where the same ones will generally pop up on the same list over and over because, well, they're the most recognizable ones, but it's like, okay, what about the awful ones that people don't remember because they were that bad? Also, to take into account that there's also all opinion based, well, it's something like Big Rigs Over the Rim Racing, where that thing didn't even function properly, in which case, no amount of a good opinion will save you from a game that doesn't function, but also one of those things, all opinion based, because someone can play a quote-unquote infamously bad game, and they might actually enjoy it and have a good time. The thing I'll bring up is Tales of Xillia. Depending on talking to a Tales of fan, they'll say Xillia is either one of the best or the best Tales of game. I disagree with this, but at the time when it was new, people were saying it was the worst Tales of game and that it should stop existing. That Tales of franchise should have died off with Xillia 1, which is still a baffling thing where people say a franchise should... No, the idea that people think a franchise can't improve unless a franchise they like, in which case they'll think maybe the next one's better. Otherwise, they'll think this franchise should die and never come back. It's done. They're washed. No one could ever make it good ever again. It's like... so many games and franchises out there we wouldn't have if people and companies and developers just decided to cut off a franchise for good at one really bad game. It's also up there where developers won't always have a perfect track record because no one can have a perfect track record when it comes to something they do. So like one of those things where, I mentioned before in a different video, people are like, you can't bash a certain remake project because it has the OG dev team working on it. And my response is, okay, your OG dev team also made The Third Birthday on PSP, which is a game that is heavily panned, but has its fans for its gameplay. Heavily panned, despised by the Parasite Eve fanbase, especially for its freaking controversial finale. So like, once again, they made a dub before, let alone the fact of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII is divisive, but it's one of those things, again, I got a perfect track record, but that shouldn't suddenly drag down the good they do. It just means they can also make mistakes and have problems. Also, none of this takes into account games that also had heavily despised reputations when they were new and everything. I mentioned Tales of Xillia and how a lot of people, a lot of fans, a lot more fans nowadays for Xillia 1, but it's like, Kingdom Hearts 2 was despised when it first got released, everything. Then later had the Final Mix version. Then later they poured that version everywhere, everyone got it, to a point where some newer fans think Final Mix was always Kingdom Hearts 2, when it wasn't. And the shock to learn, Kingdom Hearts 2 was not well liked when it came out, or typically loud voices did not like Kingdom Hearts 2 when it came out, but it's the fact that people didn't like the gameplay changes, some didn't like how easy it was, because I press X to win, stereotype everything. But once again, Final Mix later changed that, made improvements, made changes, even minute details. So one of those things where will we consider Kingdom Hearts 2 to be a game that's still despised and quote-unquote infamous before Final Mix completely 180's reputation? Metal Gear Solid 2 and Halo 2 also had a lot of hate because of the fact of the other playable character they didn't mention during marketing that you'd be playing as in the game. But like I said, later years, people just enjoyed the games for what they were. Metal Gear Solid 2 is my favorite entry, but I'm also a person who played it after the reveal, after everything, so I knew going in I'd be playing as a different character than Solid Snake. Halo 2, I knew nothing about, I just went, yo, this Arbiter guy is super cool, I like him, I want to play more as him than the Master Chief guy, kind of thing. But again, do we keep the reputation that, oh, those games weren't liked when they released? The game Deadly Premonition, something I only ever saw 2 content creators ever actually talk about because the game was heavily despised, but nowadays has a positive reputation, even though I'll say that game's gameplay is ass. I don't care what anybody says. The game's good points are its writing, its world building, not for its gameplay. And I have played that game on PS3, I play it on Switch. The gameplay is still ass and it is a boogie mess, but I'd play it again. Bioshock 2, I remember that one being hated when it came out, simply because people kept comparing it to the narrative quality of Bioshock 1 and ignoring any gameplay improvements Bioshock 2 did. It's only in recent years started people saying, actually, Bioshock 2 is the best because it plays the best everything. Some would say it's because Bioshock Infinite came out and people changed their mind on 2, which sometimes does happen where a later game that people like less comes out and then people end up revisiting an older entry and liking it more. Or maybe it's just the die-hard Bioshock 2 fans who were there from the get-go. They're now able to scream the loudest how much they love Bioshock 2. But that was a game that was despised back when it came out, for I remember. Even just looking up, people were like, why do people hate Bioshock 2? And it's like, people compare to Bioshock 1, that's it. So I just want to ramble about because there are so many infamous games you can bring up. I can bring up Dragon Ball Taiketsu and Game Boy Advance, made by Webfoot, and that's also known for Legacy of Goku 1, but most focused on their better titles, Legacy of Goku 2 and Blues Fury. I can bring up Ballad Wonderworld, a game that failed and bombed so hard it bums me out because it looked like it was going to be shaping up to be a cool mascot platformer, and then we got to play and realized how bad idea it was. Or Batman Arkham Origins, that many will cite only got hate at release because it's being compared to Arkham City. Which is true, but also got hate because it was buggy as hell when it came out, and Warner Brothers decided, would you like to buy DLC? Instead of fixing the game ASAP. So, that was a little bit more complicated. Even if nowadays, people rightfully express their love for Batman Arkham Origins. Gotta say about it, go out there, play games. Maybe play a game that's infamously bad and try it for yourself. Maybe you'll like it. Or maybe you'll play a game that is hated within a fan base, but in reality isn't actually that bad. Or maybe you'll play some actual trash. But hey, if you play the trash, then you'll learn to appreciate what an actual good game is. You know? Helps ground your opinion and everything. Don't actively say what to play trash. Seek out games that have a bad reputation they have genuine interest in. So I got some on the topic. Alrighty then, good day.